the dust-choked towns of the Old West, a woman's worth was often measured by the man she married. But for Rosalie Quinn of Crimson Peak, her value was her own, and she'd be damned if she'd surrender it for a wedding band. They called her too stubborn to marry, a whispered insult that followed her like a shadow. She was a woman as untamed as the frontier itself, her spirit a fortress against the prying eyes and petty judgments of a world that demanded she bend. Then he arrived, a man broken by war, a scout with a past as scarred as his leg, leaning on a hickory cane and carrying the ghosts of Shiloh in his eyes. He saw the fire behind her fortress walls, and he did the one thing no one else dared. He asked for her hand. This isn't a story of a woman saved by a man. It's the story of how two outcasts in a world determined to define them by their wounds found a love story no one saw coming. The town of Crimson Peak, nestled in a valley carved by the relentless winds of the American West, was a place built on grit and gossip in that order. And in the year of our Lord, 1879, no subject fueled the town's rumour mill more than Rosie Quinn. At 27, an age when most women were wrangling their third or fourth child, Rosie remained stubbornly, resolutely unmarried. It wasn't for a lack of offers. Rather, it was a lack of interest on her part, a complete and utter refusal to be bartered like a prize heifer at the county fair. They call her too stubborn to marry, the women would whisper over their quilting bees, their needles darting as quickly as their tongues. A pity they'd cluck such a handsome girl if she'd only softened that granite jaw of hers. Rosie was more than handsome. She was striking. Her hair, the color of rich, dark soil after a storm, was often wrestled into a practical braid that fell to her waist. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue, missed nothing. They could assess the health of a horse at 20 paces, spot a brewing storm on the horizon, and most unnervingly for her, would-be suitors. See right through a man's carefully constructed facade to the quivering ambition or foolishness beneath. Her hands, unlike the pale, delicate things of other ladies her age, were calloused and capable. She could mend a fence with the same proficiency as she could stitch a wound, and she preferred the former. Her father, Thomas Quinn, a man whose pragmatism had been honed by decades of frontier life, had long since given up trying to corral his eldest daughter's spirit. He'd taught her to read ledgers, to understand crop rotation, and to shoot a rifle straight and true. In doing so, he had, as his wife Martha often lamented, made her entirely unsuitable for polite society. Martha Quinn loved her daughter fiercely, but she also despaired. Rosalie, my love. She'd plead, her voice laced with the gentle lilt of her Virginian upbringing. Mr. Finch is a man of means. His father owns the mercantile. You could have anything you desire. Rosie would look up from the book she was devouring, perhaps a treatise on botany or a history of the Roman Empire, and fix her mother with a level gaze. What I desire, mother, is not to be owned. And Mr. Alistair Finch looks at me as if he's purchasing a new mare, checking my teeth and assessing my breeding potential. Alistair Finch was by all accounts Crimson Peak's most eligible bachelor. He was dapper, with a carefully waxed moustache and a cravat that was always impeccably tied. He dripped with an air of self-importance that grated on Rosie's nerves like a rusty hinge. He had made his intentions toward Rosie clear, not with whispered sweet nothings, but with pronouncements to her father about the merging of their family interests. Their last public encounter had been at the Founder's Day picnic. Finch, smelling of bay rum and condescension, had cornered her by the lemonade table. Miss Quinn, He'd begun his smile not reaching his eyes. A fine day. Though a woman of your complexion should take care with the sun. A woman of my complexion, Mr. Finch, Rosie had replied, her voice cool and clear, is more concerned with the health of our cattle than the paleness of her skin. A concept I'm sure is foreign to you. He had sputtered his face, turning a shade of plum that clashed horribly with his cravat, while several townspeople within earshot stifled their amusement. The incident had only cemented her reputation. She wasn't just stubborn. She was sharp-tongued, and in a woman that was a sin second only to barrenness. Her younger sister Clara was everything Rosie was not. Sweet, biddable, and with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, Clara was the town's darling. She was betrothed to a young rancher, and her days were filled with dreams of lace patterns and naming her future children. Oh, Rosie, Clara would sigh, her brow furrowed with genuine concern as she practiced her embroidery. Why must you be so contrary? Don't you ever wish for a home of your own? For a husband to cherish you? I have a home, Rosie would retort, gesturing to the sprawling Quinn ranch, and I cherish my own company far more than I would the company of a man who sees me as an ornament. Besides, she'd add a glint in her eye, I have you to worry about. I received a letter from Aunt Carol in St. Louis. She mentioned a Mr. Applegate there, a supposed man of industry, who turned out to be a swindler. It pays to be discerning. The mention of Charles Applegate, a real and notorious charlatan of the era, was a subtle barb, a reminder that not all that glittered was gold, a lesson she felt Clara, in her innocent bliss, had yet to learn. Life in Crimson Peak continued in its predictable rhythm. The sun rose, casting long shadows from the jagged peaks that gave the town its name. The wind blew, carrying the scent of pine and dust. And Rosalie Quinn remained a puzzle, a woman who worked as hard as any man who spoke her mind without apology, and who met the world with a spine of steel. She was in the eyes of her neighbors, a lost cause, a woman destined to grow old alone. Her only companions, the books she so dearly loved, and the stubbornness that was her shield. They watched her, they talked about her, and they waited. Sooner or later, they believed the world would break her. They were wrong. The world was about to send her a man who was already broken, and in the ruins, they would build something stronger than the town of Crimson Peak could ever imagine. He arrived on the afternoon stage, a lone figure alighting with a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of pain. The first thing anyone noticed was the limp. He leaned heavily on a sturdy hickory cane, his right leg dragging almost uselessly behind him. The second thing they noticed was his stillness. In the hustle and bustle of the stage station, with children yelling and men unloading cargo, he stood apart, a pool of quiet in a river of noise. His name, the station master grunted to those who asked, was Josiah Walker. He carried a single battered carpet bag, and a look in his pale grey eyes that seemed to hold the vast empty plains and the ghosts of battles best forgotten. His face was lean, weathered by sun and hardship, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple down into his beard, a permanent, puckered reminder of some past violence. He didn't look for friendly faces. His gaze swept over the town, assessing distant, before he made his way step by painful step toward the livery. News of a stranger, especially one so obviously marked by trouble, traveled fast in Crimson Peak. By supper time, the Quinns were discussing him, a war man, by the looks of him. Thomas Quinn said carving into a roasted chicken. Saw too many like him after the surrender. lost. "He's looking for work," Mr. Quinn continued, glancing at Rosie. "The stable master said he's handy with horses, but quiet. Asks for nothing but a day's wage and a place to lay his head." Martha Quinn shuddered delicately. "Thomas, you can't be serious. A man like that, a drifter, it's not proper." "We need help with the north pasture fence." Thomas countered, his practical nature overriding his wife's sense of propriety. "And I'd rather hire a man who's seen the elephant than some young buck who's never done a hard day's work. He can start tomorrow." Rosie said nothing, but her interest was piqued. She'd seen the man from her window as he'd crossed the main street, his slow, determined pace a stark contrast to the swagger of the local cowboys. She'd seen not just a cripple, but a man who kept moving despite the injury. There was a resilience there that the gossiping townsfolk, in their haste to label him a broken vagrant, had missed. The next morning, Josiah Joe Walker appeared at the Quinn Ranch as the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. He wore simple, clean work clothes, his haunted eyes taking in the well-kept state of the barns and corrals. Thomas Quinn explained the task, mending the long stretch of fence that bordered the wilder, rockier part of their land. It was hard, solitary work. "The wage is fair. You can take your meals with the hands in the bunkhouse," Thomas said. Joe simply nodded. "Thank you, sir." His voice was a low rasp, as if it hadn't been used much of late. Rosie's first direct encounter with him happened that afternoon. She was riding her spirited mare, Boudica, checking on a spring in the north pasture when she saw him. He was working with a methodical, unhurried rhythm, his movements economical and precise, despite his damaged leg. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, and she saw the landscape of his back, a road map of old wounds, silvery scars that crisscrossed his skin like angry tributaries. This was no single, clean injury. This was a man who had been torn apart and somehow stitched himself back together. Her horse, ever sensitive, shied at the sight of the stranger. Rosie calmed her with a firm hand and a soft word. Joe had stopped his work, his hand resting on a fence post. He watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer a fawning smile like Alistair Finch, or a deferential nod like the other ranch hands. He simply looked at her, his grey eyes acknowledging her presence. "Your fence is well built, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily on the dry air. "Good cedar posts. Should last." It was an unexpected opening. He wasn't complimenting her appearance or commenting on the weather. He was talking about the fence. "My father believes in doing a thing right." The first time Rosie replied, her tone more neutral than she intended. "A wise man," Joe said, turning his attention back to his work, stretching a length of wire. The conversation, it seemed, was over. For days their interactions were much the same, fleeting, practical, and strangely comfortable in their brevity. He never sought her out, but he was always there. She'd find a gate, previously stubborn, now swinging smoothly on well-oiled hinges. A loose stone in the path to the springhouse would be replaced. Small, almost invisible acts of consideration. He took his meals alone, away from the boisterous laughter and card games of the other hands. One evening, drawn by a curiosity she wouldn't admit, to Rosie walked past the bunkhouse. She saw him sitting on the porch steps, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, 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 a lonely sound in the twilight. He spoke of his past only once in a fragmented story, told to her father that she overheard. He'd been a scout, he said, for the Union Army. He mentioned serving under a commander whose name she didn't recognize and spoke of a brutal skirmish. Sergeant Miller, a good man from Ohio. He didn't make it out. Joe had said his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet the memory was a palpable weight in the air. "That's where I got this." He gestured vaguely to his leg. He never spoke of it again. The name Sergeant Miller was common, but for Rosie it put a face, however imagined, to the ghosts that haunted this quiet, broken man. The town, of course, had its own theories. He was a deserter, some said. A bounty hunter, others whispered. A man fleeing the law. His silence was a canvas onto which they painted their darkest fears and most lurid fantasies. Alistair Finch, in particular, took a dislike to the new hand, Quinn. "You should be careful," Finch warned her father at the Mercantile. "Hiring such riff-raff. It lowers the tone of a respectable establishment." Rosie, who had been inspecting seed packets nearby, turned. "Mr. Walker has done more honest work in a week than you have in your entire life, Mr. Finch. Perhaps it is the tone of your character that needs examining." Finch's face flushed, and he stalked away. But Rosie's defense of the quiet scout did not go unnoticed. The whispers in Crimson Peak shifted. The stubborn spinster and the broken soldier. What the town wondered could possibly come of that. They saw two damaged people. Two outcasts. They couldn't conceive that these two solitary souls might see something in each other that no one else could, a reflection of their own resilient, unyielding spirit. The courtship of Rosalie Quinn and Josiah Walker was not one of stolen glances across a crowded ballroom or flowery sonnets recited in the moonlight. It was a courtship conducted in the language of the frontier itself, silence, observation, and shared practical purpose. It unfolded slowly like a desert flower, blooming in its own time, unseen by those who only looked for the garish and the grand. Joe never brought her flowers. Instead, he'd leave a perfectly formed arrowhead he'd found by the creek on the porch railing for her, a silent acknowledgement of their shared appreciation for things forged by time and pressure. Rosie never batted her eyelashes at him. Instead, when she saw him struggling to lift a heavy roll of wire, she wouldn't call for another hand, but would walk over and take the other end herself. Her quiet assistance, a statement of partnership that required no words. He began to see the woman the town refused to. He saw her gentleness with a newborn calf, the way she spoke to her horse in a low, soothing murmur. He watched as she patiently taught a young ranch hand, a boy no older than 17, how to read using an old almanac as their text. He saw that her stubbornness was a fierce protective shell around a core of deep compassion and unshakable integrity. She wasn't hard. She was strong. There was a world of difference. And Rosie began to see beyond the limp and the scars. She saw the keen intelligence in his eyes as he tracked a stray steer, reading the story of its passage in the bent grass and overturned stones. She saw the quiet dignity with which he endured the stares and whispers of the townspeople. She saw a man who had faced the very worst of humanity and had chosen not bitterness, but a quiet, solitary peace. He wasn't broken. He was healing. One blistering afternoon, she found him by the creek, his bad leg submerged in the cool, rushing water. He wasn't wearing his boot, and she saw the full extent of the old injury. The flesh was a mangled tapestry of scar tissue, the ankle unnaturally twisted. It was a wound that would never fully heal, a constant nagging source of pain. Any other woman might have gasped or looked away in pity. Rosie simply dismounted Boudica and came to sit on the bank a few feet away, pulling a worn copy of Walden from her saddlebag. She didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She just shared the silence with him, her presence a balm, not an intrusion. After a long while, he spoke, his voice low. "It bothers you to see it." She looked up from her book, her blue eyes meeting his grey ones without a flicker of revulsion. "It bothers me that it hurts you," she said simply. "It doesn't bother me to see it. A scar is just a story written on the skin." A flicker of something surprise, gratitude, something deeper passed through his eyes. In that moment, a bond was forged stronger than any flirtatious promise. He was used to people seeing his wound. He was not used to them seeing him. The turning point, the event that fused their quiet understanding into an undeniable connection, came with the fury of the sky. The storm rolled in without warning, a black-brosed monster that turned the afternoon sky to twilight. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-whipped sheets. The dry creek bed that snaked through the valley became a raging, muddy torrent in minutes. A flash flood. The panicked shouts of the ranch hands alerted everyone. A section of the lower pasture fence had been washed away, and a small group of heifers, including a prize-winning one of her fathers, were trapped on the wrong side of the rising water. Men on horseback charged toward, the chaos shouting orders, their efforts brave but disorganized. Alistair Finch, who had been visiting her father to once again press his suit, stood on the porch yelling useless advice and making a great show of his concern, while taking care not to get his polished boots muddy. Rosie was already moving. She grabbed a coil of rope, her mind working quickly, assessing the currents, the terrain. It was then that Joe appeared at her side, his limp more pronounced as he hurried. He didn't ask what to do. He saw her intent, and his mind immediately aligned with hers. The old oak. He said, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the roar of the water. "Its roots will hold. If we can get a rope across, we can create a guide for them to follow to higher ground." It was a scout solution, quick, intelligent, and using the landscape itself as a tool. While others saw chaos, he saw a path. What followed was a masterclass in unspoken teamwork. He secured one end of the rope around the massive trunk of the ancient oak, his knots swift and sure. Rosie, mounted on Boudica, plunged into the churning water, the powerful mare fighting the current. It was a dangerous, reckless act, and her father yelled her name from the bank, his voice thick with fear. But Joe was calm. He was feeding out the rope, his hands steady, his eyes locked on her, his focus absolute. He shouted instructions not of command, but of guidance. To the left, let the current do the work. Keep her head up. Rosie reached the other side, soaked and shivering but successful. Together, they created a taut guideline. With Joe on one side and Rosie on the other, they guided the terrified cattle across the treacherous water one by one. It was grueling, terrifying work. By the time the last heifer was safe, they were both exhausted, covered in mud and standing in the pouring rain. The other men stood by, humbled and silent. Finch looked on his mouth slightly agape, his own inaction a stark contrast to their raw competence. As the rain softened to a drizzle, Rosie walked back across the now receding creek. Joe met her, his face grim with exhaustion, but his eyes shining with an emotion she had never seen there before. He reached out, not to touch her, but to steady a trembling heifer. Their hands brushed a brief contact of mud-caked, calloused skin. It felt more intimate than a kiss. That evening, as Rosie tended to a cut on her arm, she found a small, carefully wrapped package on her windowsill. Inside was a tin of medicated salve. She knew without asking who had left it. She also knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that something had irrevocably shifted between them. The town of Crimson Peak could whisper all it wanted. Their story was no longer written in silence, but in the shared experience of survival, in the quiet language of mutual respect. And it was far from over. A letter arrived for her father a few days later, a reply from a cousin in the East who had suffered a grievous injury. The treatment recommended by Dr. Samuel Mudd proved to be a godsend, the letter read. The name, that of the infamous doctor who had treated John Wilkes Booth, was a chilling reminder of how easily a man's reputation and his life could be ruined by association and circumstance, a lesson that would soon prove all too relevant for Joe and Rosie. The proposal, when it came, was as unadorned and direct as the man who delivered it. It happened a week after the flood on a Sunday afternoon. The air was washed clean, and the scent of damp earth and sagebrush filled the valley. Rosie was sitting on the front porch mending a leather bridle, her hands moving with practiced ease. Joe Walker approached not with the hesitance of a suitor, but with the steady purpose of a man who had made a decision. He'd cleaned up. His hair was damp and neatly combed. He wore a clean shirt, and he held his hat, not his cane, in his hands. He stood before her, the porch steps separating them. For a moment he said nothing, his grey eyes simply holding hers. The usual clamour of the ranch, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of the hands seemed to fade into a respectful silence. "Rosalie," he began, and the use of her full name, spoken in his low, resonant voice, sent a shiver down her spine. "I am not a man of property. I have no land to my name, no fortune to offer. What I have is a strong back, 2 willing hands, and a past that I don't hide, but that I don't let define me." He took a slow breath. "I have watched you. I see who you are. Not who they say you are, but who you are. You are honest, and you are strong, and you are kind. You are the truest person I have ever known." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I am asking for your hand in marriage. I'm not asking you to be my wife in the way this town understands it. I am asking you to be my partner, to build a life with me side by side, to face whatever comes together." It wasn't a plea. It was a statement, a proposition between equals. He wasn't offering her a life of ease or luxury. He was offering her respect, a commodity she valued far more. He was offering her a partnership, the very thing she had always craved, but never believed she would find. Tears welled in Rosie's eyes, shocking her. She who never cried felt a profound, aching joy that threatened to overwhelm her. She set the bridle aside, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes," she whispered the word, feeling both momentous and perfectly natural. "Yes, Josiah. I will." A slow, genuine smile transformed his scarred face, reaching his eyes and erasing years of pain and solitude. He didn't rush up the steps. He simply nodded a deep, affirming gesture. The deal was sealed. If their courtship had been a quiet affair, the announcement of their engagement was a thunderclap that shook Crimson Peak to its foundations. Rosie told her parents that evening. Her father Thomas was taken aback, his fork clattering against his plate. He looked from his daughter's determined face to the memory of the quiet, capable man who had worked his land and saved his cattle. After a long, tense silence, he slowly nodded. "He is a good man, Rosalie. A man of substance." Her mother. Martha, however, was aghast. "Rosalie." "Quinn." "Have you taken leave of your senses?" she cried, her hands flying to her cheeks. A vagrant, a crippled drifter with no name and no prospects. After we have worked so hard, after Mr. Finch has shown such interest. What will people say? I do not care what people will say. Rosie said, her voice firm, but not unkind. I care that he is a good and honorable man who respects me. He sees me, Mother. Something Mr. Finch has never been capable of. Respect doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't buy a new bonnet. Martha lamented, dissolving into tears. Clara, her pretty face a mask of confusion, tried to comfort her mother while staring at Rosie as if she'd grown a second head. The news hit the town the next day and spread like wildfire. It was a scandal, a tragedy, a comedy, depending on who was telling it. The women at the quilting bee nearly snapped their needles in their excitement. The men at the saloon debated it over whiskey. The stubborn spinster who could have had the wealthiest man in town had thrown herself away on a broken-down soldier. Alistair Finch's reaction was volcanic. His courtship of Rosie had been a public spectacle, a matter of pride. Her refusal was an insult. Her choice of Joe Walker was a public humiliation of the highest order. He confronted her outside the mercantile, his face a mottled red, his voice shaking with fury. You would choose that half-man over me. He sneered, his voice loud enough for all to hear. Have you no shame, no sense of your own worth? He is nothing, a piece of human wreckage washed up on your father's charity. Rosie's composure was absolute. She met his rage with an icy calm that only infuriated him further. My sense of worth, Mr. Finch, is precisely why I am marrying him. He is 10 times the man you are, for he has faced true hardship and retained his honor. Something you in your pampered existence could never understand. She turned and walked away, leaving him sputtering in impotent fury. The scene was recounted with relish all over town, but Finch's venom had its effect. The gossip turned darker, more personal. Cruel whispers followed Joe wherever he went. They speculated about the nature of his wounds, implying they were the result of cowardice. They mocked Rosie's choice, suggesting she must be desperate or deranged. The pressure mounted. Martha Quinn took to her bed with a headache, refusing to see visitors. Clara pleaded with Rosie, her eyes full of tears. Think of the family, Rosie. Think of my own wedding. People are laughing at us. Let them laugh, Rosie said, her jaw set. Their laughter is the braying of fools. It means nothing. But it did mean something. It meant that she and Joe were islands in a sea of hostility. One evening Joe found her staring out at the darkening mountains, her shoulders slumped for the first time. He came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. This is harder than you let on, he said. It wasn't a question. I knew they would talk. She admitted, her voice low. I just didn't anticipate the hatred. It's as if our happiness is an insult to them. It is, Joe said simply. We don't fit into their neat little boxes. People fear what they don't understand, and they hate what they fear. He reached out and for the first time took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his grip was gentle. But their hatred is their burden, Rosalie, not ours. We will not carry it for them. In his simple, profound words, Rosie found her strength renewed. He was right. Theirs was a private treaty, a nation of 2. Let the rest of the world rage. Within the fortress of their shared understanding, they were safe. But as they stood there, hand in hand against the world, neither of them knew that Alistair Finch's humiliation was curdling into something far more dangerous than gossip. He was not a man to forgive a slight, and his revenge would threaten to destroy not just their future, but the very foundations of the town that had judged them so harshly. Alistair Finch's public fury was merely a mask for a private, gnawing panic. His desire for Rosie Quinn had been twofold. Her beauty and spirit were a prize to be possessed, but more importantly, a marriage to the Quinns, whose ranch comprised a huge swath of the valley, was the final piece in a very dangerous puzzle he had been assembling. For months, Finch had been engaged in a scheme of audacious fraud. Using his position at the mercantile and his father's good name, he had been buying up debt from struggling ranchers and farmers, then using obscure legal loopholes and forged documents to foreclose on their properties for a fraction of their worth. His plan was to consolidate the land and sell it at an enormous profit to the railroad, which he knew through a corrupt contact in the territorial government was planning a route through Crimson Peak. The Quinn Ranch was the crown jewel of this scheme. The first hint that something was amiss came from an unlikely source, Peter O'Reilly, the town blacksmith. O'Reilly was a quiet man, a widower with a mind as sharp as the steel he forged. His wife had died a year prior, and the grief had sent him into a spiral of debt, a debt Alistair Finch had quietly bought up. O'Reilly had recently been served with a foreclosure notice that felt deeply wrong. He approached Thomas Quinn one evening, his face etched with worry. "Thomas, something ain't right. Finch is calling my debt, but the paperwork, it's got dates on it from before he even bought the note. And he's offering me pennies on the dollar for my smithy land included." Thomas, a man who valued fairness, was troubled. He promised to look into it. But it was Joe, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, who felt a familiar prickle of suspicion. He had seen this kind of vulture-like behavior before in the chaotic aftermath of the war, when opportunists preyed on the displaced and the desperate. Joe began to listen. He used the skills that had kept him alive as a scout to move unseen, to gather information without appearing to piece together a story from whispers and half-glances. He'd sit in the saloon, nursing a single beer for an hour, listening to the grumbling of other ranchers who were feeling squeezed. He'd observe the flow of paperwork at the mercantile, the private meetings Finch held with slick-looking men who arrived on the stage and left just as quickly. His investigation was given a crucial piece of evidence by Rosie herself. Her stubbornness, which the town scorned, was in fact a manifestation of her meticulous and organized mind. She kept impeccable records for the ranch, and she remembered every dealing her father had ever had. Finch approached Papa about buying the old Miller homestead. 2 months ago, she told Joe one night, as they sat under a sky littered with stars. Old man Miller passed without any kin, and the land went to the county. Finch claimed he was buying it to expand his father's business. "I remember because the deed transfer he showed Papa had Judge Hemlock's signature on it. But Judge Hemlock was visiting his sister in Denver that entire week. I know because I had to wait for him to return to file a water rights claim. It was a small detail anyone else would have overlooked. To Joe, it was a key, a forged signature. He began to connect the dots. O'Reilly's suspect foreclosure, the land grabs from other indebted ranchers, the forged deed. Finch wasn't just a jilted suitor, he was a criminal. And his desperation to marry Rosie had been about acquiring her family's land without a fight. Her rejection hadn't just wounded his pride, it had threatened to unravel his entire conspiracy. The danger was escalating. One of the ranchers who had publicly accused Finch of cheating was found beaten in an alley, his arm broken. He claimed it was a robbery, but his eyes were full of fear. Finch was using hired muscle, the same slick men from the stagecoach, to intimidate anyone who dared to question him. Joe knew they couldn't go to the local sheriff, a man who was firmly in the pocket of the elder Finch. They needed outside help, and they needed irrefutable proof. "We need a lawman who can't be bought," Joe said to Rosie and her father, their faces grim in the lamplight of the Quinn kitchen. "A man who answers to the federal government." Rosie, ever practical, nodded. "I've read about the U.S. Marshals in the territories. They say there's one man, a deputy, who is relentless. They say he's never failed to bring in his man dead or alive." "What's his name?" Thomas asked. Joe answered, his voice low and steady. "His name is Bass Reeves." The name hung in the air with a weight of its own. Bass Reeves was already a legend in the Indian Territory, and beyond a black lawman of impeccable courage and skill. Getting a message to him would be difficult and dangerous, but it was their only hope. While they sent a rider out under the cover of darkness with a carefully worded letter addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Smith. Joe and Rosie worked to gather the final pieces of proof. Their loyalty to each other was now forged in shared peril. The town that had scorned them was the very place they were now trying to save from a predator in its midst. Rosie used her connections, speaking quietly with the wives of the threatened ranchers. Under the guise of exchanging recipes or borrowing thread, she confirmed timelines, gathered stories, and built a tapestry of Finch's deceit. Her social ostracism now became a tool. People spoke freely around the stubborn spinster, never imagining she was meticulously documenting their Quins. Joe, meanwhile, did the one thing Finch would never expect. He used his crippled leg to his advantage. Posing as a down-on-his-luck drifter looking for a handout, he was able to get close to Finch's hired thugs in the saloon. He played dumb, lamented his own misfortune, and gleaned crucial information about their operation and where Finch kept his real ledger. Not the official one at the mercantile, but a private one, detailing his fraudulent acquisitions. The trap was slowly being set. But Finch, growing more paranoid as his plans stalled, was becoming unstable. His animosity was no longer just aimed at the town, but was laser-focused on the two people who had defied him, the woman who had rejected him, and the broken soldier she had chosen. He saw them everywhere, their quiet confidence, a constant mockery of his power. He began to watch them, his mind twisting their every action into a threat. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more violent and public than anyone in Crimson Peak could ever have foreseen. The tension in Crimson Peak stretched thin, ready to snap. Alistair Finch, feeling the invisible net closing around him, decided to force the issue. His plan was to call a town meeting under the pretense of discussing civic improvements, but his real goal was to publicly intimidate the remaining landowners on his list, including Thomas Quinn, into selling. He would use the weight of public opinion and the presence of his hired enforcers to create an atmosphere of fear, ensuring no one would dare to oppose him. The meeting was held in the town hall, a stuffy wood-paneled room packed with the citizens of Crimson Peak. Finch stood at the front, flanked by two of his hired men, burly, grim-faced individuals who looked dangerously out of place. He spoke with his usual oily charm, but there was a hard, menacing edge to his voice as he outlined his vision for the town's future, a vision that hinged on consolidating land for a major transportation partner. Thomas Quinn sat with his arms crossed, his face a stony mask. Rosie was beside him, her gaze fixed on Finch, her expression one of cool contempt. Joe Walker, however, was not in the hall. He was at that moment engaged in a far more dangerous task. Using the information he had gathered, Joe knew that while Finch was grandstanding at the town hall, His office at the back of the mercantile, where the real ledger was hidden, would be empty. His bad leg, usually a hindrance, was now his cover. No one would suspect a cripple of being a cat burglar. He slipped down the back alley, the sounds of the meeting a low murmur in the distance. The lock on the office door was cheap. It took him less than a minute with a piece of wire. Inside the office smelled of Finch's Bay rum and stale cigar smoke. It was meticulously tidy, a testament to Finch's vanity. Joe went straight to the hiding place he'd been told about a false bottom in a large crate of imported French wine. Prying it open, he found it. The ledger. He flipped through the pages. It was all there, the illegal foreclosures, the doctored dates, the names of the ranchers he'd cheated, and most damningly the details of his agreement with the corrupt railroad agent. As Joe slipped the ledger inside his coat, he heard a noise. One of Finch's thugs, the one who was supposed to be guarding the front, had circled around the back for a smoke. Joe froze. The man's footsteps were heavy on the boardwalk, coming closer. There was no other exit. Joe flattened himself into the shadows behind the door, his heart pounding. The door creaked open. Back at the town hall, Finch had moved to the heart of his plan. "And so," he said, his voice ringing with false generosity, "for the good of the community, I am prepared to make a final fair offer to those few remaining property owners like Mr. Quinn who have yet to join our great enterprise." He looked directly at Thomas, his smile a predator's grin. Of course, refusing to cooperate would be most unfortunate for the town's progress. The threat was clear. The room was silent, the air thick with fear. It was then that Rosie stood up. All eyes turned to her. "Unfortunate for whom, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. "Unfortunate for the people you have systematically cheated and intimidated, for Peter O'Reilly, for the widow Jensen, whose ranch you stole for less than the price of her cattle." A shocked gasp went through the crowd. Finch's face went white with rage. "You have no proof. These are the ravings of a bitter, scorned woman." "Am I?" Rosie counted, her chin high. "Or am I a woman who knows that Judge Hemlock was in Denver when you supposedly obtained his signature on the Miller deed?" The mention of this specific, verifiable fact sent a ripple of doubt through the audience. They had seen her as stubborn, but they also knew she was meticulous and, above all, honest. Finch, panicking, motioned to his men. "This meeting is over. This woman is hysterical." But before his thugs could move toward her, the back doors of the hall burst open. Joe Walker stood there, leaning on his cane, the stolen ledger held high in his hand. His face was bruised, and his lip was split, the result of a brief, brutal encounter with the guard in the alley, an encounter Joe, using the element of surprise and the brutal efficiency learned in war, had won. "Looking for this Finch?" Joe called out, his voice a gravelly boom. "I believe this ledger tells a very different story from the one you've been spinning." The room erupted. Finch, completely unmasked, let out a strangled cry of fury. His facade of civility shattered, revealing the desperate rat beneath. He pulled a derringer from his waistcoat pocket and aimed it not at Joe, but at Rosie. "You!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "This is all your fault, you stubborn bitch!" Time seemed to slow. Thomas Quinn lunged for his daughter. But Joe was already moving. He was no longer a limping, broken soldier. He was a scout, a predator, his body reacting with pure instinct. He threw the heavy ledger with all his might. It spun through the air, catching Finch squarely in the chest. The shot from the derringer went wild, shattering a window. Finch staggered back, gasping for air. Joe closed the distance in 3 long, loping strides, his limp forgotten. He didn't throw a punch. He simply slammed Finch against the wall, his forearm pressed against his throat, his grey eyes burning with a cold, controlled fury that was more terrifying than any loud rage. "It's over," Joe said, his voice dangerously quiet. The spell of fear was broken. Peter O'Reilly and 2 other ranchers surged forward, grabbing Finch's stunned and now leaderless thugs. The town, which had moments before been cowed into submission, had found its courage. As the townsmen secured a screaming, defeated Alistair Finch, Joe released him and turned to Rosie. He moved to her side, his eyes scanning her for any injury. He gently touched her arm, his hand trembling slightly from the adrenaline. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice for her alone. She looked at him, at his bruised face, his steady eyes at the man who had walked through the fire for her, for the town, and nodded, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. "I am now." The reckoning had come. Not from a legendary lawman, but from the quiet courage of the 2 people Crimson Peak had so readily dismissed. The stubborn spinster and the broken soldier had not only saved themselves, they had saved the town from itself. The downfall of Alistair Finch was as swift as it was total. The ledger, with its damning evidence, combined with the testimony of a dozen emboldened townspeople, sealed his fate. When a U.S. Marshal, not Bass Reeves himself, but a stern-faced deputy, sent in his stead, finally arrived a week later, it was not to investigate a crime, but simply to transport a prisoner. Finch was gone, and the shadow he had cast over Crimson Peak went with him. The town was forced into a period of uncomfortable self-reflection. They had been so quick to judge Rosie for her spirit, and Joe for his scars. They had gossiped and mocked all, while a true villain operated in plain sight, preying on their neighbors. The public apologies were awkward and halting, but they were made. Mrs. Miller, the leader of the quilting bee, brought Rosie a peace-offering quilt. The saloon owner offered Joe free drinks for life, an offer Joe politely declined. They were no longer the stubborn spinster and the broken soldier. They were Rosalie and Josiah, or more often simply, the Quinns. Their wedding was not the grand affair Martha Quinn had once dreamed of for her daughter. It was held on a crisp autumn afternoon on the porch of the Quinn Ranch, the same porch where Joe had made his simple, honest proposal. The guests were few. Rosie's parents, her sister Clara, Peter O'Reilly, and a handful of the ranchers they had helped. Thomas Quinn. His eyes, shining with pride, stood beside his daughter. Martha, having finally understood that her daughter's happiness was more important than society's approval, wept quiet tears of joy. Rosie wore a simple dress of deep blue, the color of her eyes. She was not given away by her father like property. Instead, she walked to Joe's side and took his hand, 2 equals meeting to forge a union. The circuit preacher, a man with kind eyes, kept the service short and meaningful. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Joe didn't kiss her with a flourish of passion. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his scarred thumb stroking her cheek, and looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. The kiss they shared was a quiet promise, a seal on their private treaty. Their life together was not a fairy tale. It was something far better. It was real. They didn't magically inherit a fortune or live a life of leisure. They built their life with their own 4 hands. With the money her father gave them as a wedding gift, they bought Peter O'Reilly's smithy and the land around it. The foreclosure was of course nullified, but O'Reilly was ready to move on to start fresh in a new territory. Joe, it turned out, had a knack for working with metal, a skill learned out of necessity during the war. His hands, which had known the cold steel of a rifle, now learned the warm, pliable strength of the forge. He shod horses, mended plows, and created tools that were known throughout the valley for their quality. His limp never vanished, and on cold, damp days the pain was a heavy burden, but he never complained. On those days, Rosie would be there, her presence a silent comfort, ready with a hot poultice and a shared cup of coffee. Rosie did not become a demure housewife. She became the backbone of their shared enterprise. She ran the books with a sharp mind that no one dared call stubborn anymore. She planted a large garden, its bounty feeding them and providing extra income. She continued to read, to learn to engage with the world on her own terms. Her sharp tongue was now seen for what it was, a sharp wit and a keen intelligence. Their home was not filled with the clamor of a dozen children, but with the quiet hum of mutual respect and deep abiding love. Their evenings were spent reading by the fire, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes discussing everything from politics to crop rotation. They were partners in every sense of the word. They had faced the judgment of the world and the malice of a dangerous man, not by changing who they were, but by holding fast to it. Their love story became a quiet legend in Crimson Peak, a cautionary tale for gossips and an inspiration for those who felt they didn't fit. It was a story not of a damsel in distress and a knight in shining armor, but of two strong, solitary souls who saw the truth in each other. They understood that scars were not signs of weakness, but symbols of survival. They knew that true strength wasn't about bending to the will of others, but about having the courage to forge your own path side by side into the vast, uncertain, and beautiful frontier of a shared life. They had been called outcasts, but together they had found their home. And so the story of Rosalie and Josiah comes to a close. It's a powerful reminder that the strongest love stories aren't always the loudest. They're often found in the quiet spaces, in the shared glances, in the unwavering support when the world turns its back. It's a testament to the fact that our scars don't define us, and that a spirit that refuses to be broken is the most valuable thing a person can possess. If their story of courage, love, and quiet defiance resonated with you, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps us bring more stories like this to light. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit and unconventional love. And most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more legends and unsung heroes of the past to share with you, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.